Dead by Daylight is an asymmetrical
Horror game.
developed by Behavior Interactive that pits one player, the killer, up against 4 survivors. The objective of the game for the killer is to rid each match of as many survivors as possible, while survivors do their best to complete 5 of the 7 generators that power the exit gates to every map, thus allowing for their escape. The game's premise is simple enough, but as you might imagine, things quickly become extremely complicated as you begin to learn about the meta of character and perk selection and its resulting effects on gameplay. Players can choose from a selection of killers to use in-game for each match. The number of killers available at the time of me writing this script is 22, with the twins being the most recent release out of the bunch. Each killer comes varying gameplay. Some killers might be faster with a more straightforward power to use against survivors, while others will have a slower speed but will be met with a more versatile or straight up broken power to compensate. This variation in killer performance in such a binary game means that one killer is always going to be the best in an objective manner, while others are going to fall by the wayside simply because they aren't designed well enough to keep pace with the required game speed at medium to top levels of play. In fact, in your first year of playing, you might find yourself buying killers to unlock their associated perks while never touching them in-game simply because they don't offer anything competitively. This isn't such a big problem for players who are newer or more casual, but becomes more and more apparent and bothersome as you learn about the game's underlying strategies and balance issues. For example, you can argue that a good player might be able to make an underpowered character like the Trapper work at rank 5 and above, every so often, but you cannot argue that the Nurse, a character who is considered one of the, if not the best killers in the game, isn't going to yield better results 100% of the time. For most players who are unfamiliar with the game, this may seem like a non-issue. After all, plenty of competitive games have this inescapable dilemma of meta versus non-meta characters or playstyles being developed into their respective designs. League of Legends, Defense of the Ancients, and Hearthstone are all prime examples of this. Games that shine in a competitive setting, but also have balance issues that will always be present simply because perfect balance is inachievable outside of something like chess. The problem with Dead by Daylight on this front, though, is that the issue isn't meta versus non-meta, it's viability versus non-viability. With a game like League of Legends, you might not be giving yourself an optimal chance of winning if you take a character with a low win rate into the match, but you can still succeed if you play properly without making too many mistakes. With Dead by Daylight, on the other hand, going into a match as a killer against survivors of even just equal skill without at least a B-tier killer spells almost certain doom. This is especially true when said survivors come into the match with perks, items, or offerings that will shape the game's green against you before it's even begun. Medkits, which allow survivors to heal at increased or instant speeds, toolboxes, which make repairing generators a bit less of a headache, and flashlights, which can blind killers, along with a number of other items, can be brought into the match to supplement a survivor's playstyle, and thus put you into an even worse position than you might have already been in. On the other hand, killers can bring add-ons and offerings that range from so useless they might as well not be in the game at all, to downright broken. This is true for perks that find their way to the top of the meta game as well. Perks like Decisive Strike and Hex Ruin are almost always run on every survivor and killer build simply because they are objectively stronger than any other perk in the game at accomplishing what they are designed to do. This power dynamic of broken versus non-broken items, offerings, and perks creates an anxiety-ridden relationship between survivors and killers where they both have to try and gauge just how broken the other team is going to try to make the match so they can follow suit. For killers, this is somewhat doable, but for survivors, they have no way to tell what they are going to play against unless they look into the log files of the games themselves, which as far as I know is against the rules anyway. Not that its very apparent behavior would be able to ban someone who did it. It would be nice to see a pre-game pick-ban lobby similar to what you see in League of Legends, where the survivors and killers can take power away from each other and put power into their own kits that responds to the perks and items being taken away by the enemy team. Though I'm not sure how that would be implemented, and given how many years it's taken Behavior to nerf something as obvious as Mori's, I doubt they have the wherewithal or talent to make something like that happen anyway. When these issues aren't running right in a match, Dead by Daylight shines as a game of push and pull between an unstoppable killer and a group of survivors who have to use efficient gameplay and wit to complete their objectives. It's during these times that I find myself really enjoying the game, even when I come out on the losing end of it. Chases are exciting and filled with mind games that test each player's long-term experience. Hooking survivors to throw them closer to death feels strategic and intentional as you plan your next move beyond each of those small victories. Everyone is looking 2 steps ahead of themselves, and it makes the climaxes for each of those matches all the more satisfying as you pull off a play that enemies don't expect, or vice versa. Unfortunately, this is an experience that the average player will find themselves in all too rarely to warrant an investment of any significant amount of time. For the hardcore players, the lack of consistency is something we deal with, but ultimately we know that we're playing around the game and its flaws, more so than playing in the game and its strengths. And we're doing it purely for the sake of making sure our opponents have a fair match, and hopes they do the same for us. Basically, every player is on edge about what their opponent is going to do, and it's usually in an order that goes something like this. First, my opponent is likely going to use an offering to gain an unfair advantage. If they don't do that, they're almost certainly going to use items or add-ons to accomplish that for them. And if they manage not to do that, they are almost guaranteed, almost 100% of the time in the game's current state, to use a combination of perks to get that advantage anyway. Ruin and Undying, Decisive Strike and Unbreakable, No Mither and Self-Care. It's fine if you don't know what these perks are or what they do. Suffice it to say, they turn the game into one team's favor and trade for it being unenjoyable and toxic for the opponents a majority of the time. And even if none of this kind of thing occurs, you're still banking on the game working properly. Which, I mean, I don't know. And that's my main gripe with this game as a whole. The design of it, from something as small as an offering to as large as the tiles you play the game on, are all procured in a way that makes one side extremely powerful and the other side next to helpless. The maps are unbalanced one way or another. The tiles, which is a term for the sections of the map you run from the killer on, are either extremely weak and dangerous or crazy strong and mostly unmind gameable. Because of this one side wins all nature of the game, DBD usually presents itself as an extremely toxic competition due to the helpless feeling it gives its players, even when no one in the game itself was going out of the way to make that happen. And this is to say nothing of when a team of friends hops into a lobby with voice communications with the sole intention of ruining a killer's day with unfair gameplay, which happens extraordinarily often at high ranks. I'd like to see more design from behavior that follows the lines of perks like Inner Strength, which rewards you for playing the game as intended in a small but meaningful way. Or for killers, I'd like new releases to match up to the same standard they put Billy at. Powerful in punishing survivors for their mistakes, but not reliant on those mistakes happening to have a decent match, since he can mind game most tiles effectively with his 115% move speed and one-hit chainsaw. Personally speaking, I'd give this game an 8 out of 10, only because it's been a huge part of my life for the past 4 years, and I think there are some people out there who would find they love the core mechanics and strategies in the game who are unwary of how much depth there really is to it. That said, since I should give a rating for the average player, I'm going to throw a less biased 6 out of 10. Decent game. But even then, if there is anyone on the fence about picking this game up, I'd wholly recommend doing so. Not because of the game it is today, necessarily, but because of the game I believe it's going to be in 1 to 2 years' time.